So in my last video, I breezed over Ashita no JOE 2 since I definitely felt it was inferior to Ashita no JOE 1, just because it had such a non-stop vibe of downwards depression. In Ashita no JOE 1, in the middle of the Rikishi arc, Joe kills Rikishi. This is the defining moment of this anime. It happens in the middle of this arc because then he spends another 10 episodes just trying to come to terms with Rikishi's death, going through this insane guilt trip, throwing away everything he had, living on the streets, completely disappearing from the world, and only being forced back to a normal life when his support circle notices how off he is. The poor people of the slums utterly love Joe Yabuki just enough to keep him alive for at least another year, you see. Ashita no JOE 2 rewinds the anime, and it starts from this point immediately after Toru Rikishi's death. Joe is seemingly restored when he comes back into contact with another cool boxer, Carlos Rivera, patron saint of saying crazy shit in English. Carlos is an all-around good dude. Honestly, Carlos is probably the nicest guy in this entire show by a long shot. He creates a massive foil to Joe Yabuki's zero fucks for anyone attitude. Like, even the people who like Joe, he treats them like shit. And Carlos is a really cool guy because he views doxing as fun. He views it as dancing. He's possibly the only character in the show to even consider the possibility that boxing could be fun. Anyway, because he likes his life, he beats Joe and resets Joe's latent desire to get revenge on anyone who beat him up that Rikishi was always so good at tapping into. Joe and Carlos finally have their ultimate match where Joe ultimately does beat Carlos, but like in the Rikishi fight, whatever Joe did to Carlos messed him up bad. Joe doesn't kill Carlos, but later on, Carlos has a battle with Jose Mendoza, where he's visibly weakened, and Mendoza destroys Carlos in under a minute, knocking him out and ruining and ending his boxing career. The ultimate tragedy of Carlos Rivera, though, is a few months later, Joe finds Carlos in the street as a brain-damaged hobo, implying that literally no one gave a shit for Carlos after his loss from Mendoza. No one took care of him. Furthermore, his coach just straight up abandoned him in Japan with no money, leaving him not being able to speak Japanese, suffering from significant brain damage, permanent punch-drunk syndrome, occasional hallucinations, and what's even more tragic about the tragedy of Carlos is that even when Joe finds him, wandering aimlessly through the ghetto where Joe lives, it's not even like Joe stops to help him or like brings him a place to sleep in the gym where he's squatting. Yoko was sponsoring Carlos to come to Japan and took no responsibility for him. And Yabuki, the man who by all accounts destroyed his brain, feels a little depressed and a little responsible for Carlos, but not responsible enough to do anything for him besides leave him dead in the gutter. God damn you, Joe Yabuki. Instead of helping Carlos, who is still alive and dying in a gutter, a continent away from any of his friends or families, and mind you, this is the 70s, so they don't even have a means of contacting him because there are no cell phones and no one's like vetting for this guy. Figuring out what happened to him, Joe decides the best that he can do is just avenge Carlos and beat up Mendoza. Not a terrible idea, but god damn it, Joe, fucking help Carlos. Mendoza is the world's strongest boxer. He kind of looks like an evil villain. He has a mustache, but he is shown to be a kind father at times, and otherwise he's just kind of like worlds away from Joe. You don't really get that much about him other than he lives in South America and he has kids. Anyway, eventually Joe gets a final fight with Mendoza. Yoko confesses her love to Yabuki right before the fight, but this is just her futile last attempt to stop him from fighting because she knows he's about to die. But he refuses it because he has absolutely hated her this entire series. And if I'm being completely real, I don't think Yoko even technically loved him back. I think Yabuki is more or less just her plaything. And since she's been playing with his life for like 2 years at this point, if she loves him at all, it's just she loves him as a toy that she fucks with. She's really just trying to stop him from killing himself because, yeah, a lot of people she loved have died in the show. Anyway, Joe fights Mendoza. He fights him so hard, punches him so hard that his goddamn hair turns white. And presumably, like all the other people Joe Yabuki fought, his boxing career ended after that. Unfortunately for Joe Yabuki, the second he fights Mendoza, the second Mendoza beats him, the fight is over and Joe is dead. He's finally happy, but he's also dead. All that miserable shit Joe Yabuki went through, all that miserable shit he lived through, and dying is the only thing that ever made him happy. Fuck Ashita no Joe 2 is a dark show. That's why I don't like it. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, time to wrap up the Ashita no Joe retrospective with Nomad. So, Megalobox adapted the Rikishi arc, the best storyographic shit that the original Joe had to offer. It skipped over the prologue and the prison arcs because, let's face it, no one likes those, and much to everyone's surprise, Megalobox was a smash hit, the likes of which the Joe franchise had not seen in decades. So a smash hit has to have a sequel, right? Well, the thing of it is that Megalobox changed so much about what Ashita no Joe is that it put the show into a really weird place. Also, ironically, where Megalobox did the best business was North America, who were mostly unaware of Ashita no Joe and its history. Now, despite changing the trajectory and taking the story into more of an original direction, Nomad does take a few major story cues from Ashita no Joe 2. Since Megalobox did the Rikishi arc, when they went into Nomad, Nomad is kind of an adaptation of Ashita no Joe 2. Nomad tells a very similar but different story to it, and it tells it in two distinct parts because it is adapting two sagas from Joe 2, the Carlos arc and the Mendoza arc. So, Nomad boils down those two arcs into three major story beats. Joe in mourning and despair over the loss of his dead friend, Joe meeting a Latin saint who fixes his soul, and finally Joe getting his fight against the world champion, who is also, coincidentally, a Latino father. Now, I think this time around they got a lot more bolder with the story because I guess they realized what really worked about Megalobox was the original stuff they did and not the stuff that was just straight up remade from Joe. My sense of the original Ashita no Joe is that the story takes place in a pretty tight time corridor of what I'm guessing to be about 3 years. I want to say they cover 1969 to 1971. It pretty much syncs up very closely time-wise with the publication of the original manga, and you can see a few seasons change over the course of the story, so yeah, that feels like it's 3 years in there. Nomad starts off with a major time skip that pushes things 6 years past the ending of Megalobox. The time skip is a necessary one to change up where they're at, but because of that, Nomad also feels very confusing when you first get into it. See, Megalobox changed things up majorly by giving Joe a happy ending, something that Yabuki Joe never gets. For Gearless Joe, everything worked out for him. Nomad has to push Gearless Joe down. It has to find him lost in the streets of Latin America, being a street fighter again, having shitty gear again, and out of nowhere in a new twist, he's addicted to painkillers, which is kind of modern with the American opioid crisis that has been going on for decades. And we start off with Joe just full on mentally gone. He's hallucinating and seeing the ghosts of Nambu watching over him, talking to him. He makes it back to his hotel, but it's really unclear when the show starts if this is literally Nambu's ghost or just Joe hallucinating from the drugs. And I think the show kind of plays it both ways, which is actually really cool. So Nomad just starts off with this massive mystery of what the fuck has gone wrong here. All my friends who saw this show just were like, what the fuck happened to Joe? How did he let things get this bad? So Joe is living in full despair under a fake name of Nomad. He's at a Spanish bar listening to a guy sing the ending song of the show. And the ending song is just so utterly sad that it subtly implies the story of what the season is going to play with, but Joe just hears it and starts instantly crying into his drugs as he listens to it, and Jesus. I have never seen an anime steer so hard into both Latin music, conventional events, and just so many real world problems that are happening now in America and ironically not Japan. I find it very interesting that as much as Carlos in Ashita was a confusing mix of incorrect stereotypes that Japan had about foreigners in America and what was in the 70s, considering he was supposed to be a Venezuelan, he had all these weird American and Mexican stereotypes. I feel like Nomad is trying to make up for that because meanwhile it's just very upfront, straight up about the struggles that Latinos face in modern America in a way that I was not prepared for and in a way that just completely blindsided me. In the way that season 1 of Ashita no Joe was a gritty boxing western, Ashita no Joe 2 was a depressing sports anime. Megalobox was meanwhile kind of a meaningful sci-fi sports allegory for boxing, and Nomad, taking it back up to the top, is a very gritty, slightly depressing boxing western. So in the first episode of Nomad, Joe crashes his motorcycle because he sees a wolf standing in the road that refuses to back down. That wolf has the same scars that Joe does, and in some weird way it represents some part of him. In the first episode, Joe also has a match with a former pro boxer named Chief. He's the same man who sang that beautiful song at the bar, and by all accounts, he's an older, uglier version of Carlos for this series. He plays a very important role as the Latin man who gets Joe out of his funk that Carlos did. And like Carlos, he totally clowns on Joe and puts him in his place for being way too serious, way too depressed, way too up his own ass and losing control of his own life. Chief knows exactly who Gearless Joe is, and he knows exactly how he's fucked up his life. And I missed this the first time I watched Nomad because I watched the dub, but I caught it in the sub that Chief just straight up berates Joe in extremely proper Spanish and not crazy English like Carlos used to do. But then again, I don't really speak Spanish, so maybe his Spanish sounds as insane to someone else as Carlos's English did to me, so that's hard to say. But Chief seemingly throws the match to Joe, outraging everyone. So afterward, Joe tries to accost Chief, but after the match, Chief easily trounces Joe because Joe's a has-been on drugs and Chief couldn't beat him if he wanted to. So at the end of the first episode, Joe re-encounters that wolf, but now that wolf is roadkill because apparently the next person to see the wolf after Joe just didn't stop and killed it. Joe buries the wolf in a shallow grave and thinks about it from time to time because I guess it meant a lot to him symbolically. After that, Joe continues journeying through Texas or California or Mexico or Japan or wherever the fuck he's at. His bike gets stolen by some illegal immigrant kids, and as it turns out, he follows them back to where Chief lives. He befriends the local Latin community as he's stuck there. He gets his bike fixed. The community is being harassed by Boss Hogg and his boys and the local government because of some property disputes. And honestly, I also found it completely crazy that Nomad is the only thing I have seen in any kind of media in the past fucking 6 years to depict the intensified racism that came out of Donald Trump's anti-immigrant movement. Joe slowly comes to terms with the fact that Dompe Nambu died, and he blames himself. He has several dramatic conversations with Nambu's ghost, who's encouraged him to get his life back together. And since Megalobox very wisely skipped over Joe's prologue arc, I was very, very appreciative that some of these conversations Joe has with Nambu's ghosts are conversations directly taken from Joe's prologue arc. Anyway, since Yuri doesn't die in Ashita no Joe, he doesn't have the relationship that original Joe and Rikishi had. So it's actually a pretty reasonable exchange for the story that they switched out Dompe's death for Rikishi's death in Megalobox, because they'd really, honestly, completely exhausted this character's backstory in Megalobox 2. Because really, the original Dompe did most of his story development in the prologue and the prison arc, and then after that he was just there because he was Joe's coach and he had no further impact on the story. So anyway, Chief locks Joe in a trailer to sober him up, and then after that, Joe becomes Chief's trainer and helps him fight through a series of fighting tournaments. After that, some white supremacists burn down Chief's trailer, and somehow he lives through the fire despite jumping into it to save pictures of his dead family. There's also a major Easter egg if you've seen Ashita no Joe that Chief's dead son is named Carlo Bonera, which is just a few letters off from Carlos Rivera, Chief's analog in the original Ashita. So anyway, Chief gets to another match which is pretty horrendous. He fights this bastard white supremacist boxer being backed up by the mob or whatever. It doesn't look good, but somehow Chief manages to pull it together, clears his mind and focuses. But unfortunately, Chief just very unclearly dies the next day after sleeping outside in his truck. I watched this episode twice and I had no idea what went on. So I actually had a conversation with someone who knew boxing better than I did. And apparently because Chief was repeatedly hit in the back of the head with illegal punches that never are allowed in normal boxing, what probably happened is Chief got either a brain clot or a concussion, or it could have even disconnected his brainstem from the spots where he was hit. So, by all accounts, he likely had a concussion and he likely might have even realized it. So when Chief went to sleep, he was dead. That's why he didn't get back up. He knew what happened. So Chief dies, and when he dies, he leaves an inheritance for the people of the trailer park to buy back their land, so they no longer have to deal with threats from the mob and they can legitimately live on their own land. And that ends Chief's arc. After this, Chief's family gives Joe his gear, and then Joe drives back up north from Mexico to Tokyo on his motorcycle. And I'm so impressed by that. And I'm not exaggerating this either, because literally, by all accounts, the place where Megalobox takes place is definitely Tokyo, and literally the place where Joe is at the start of Nomad is clearly America. It's very confusing how the geography works. But anyway, he goes back to the bridge gym, and he gets his ass beat by a very jaded and angry teenage Sachio. Now, a key point in Nomad is that Sachio hates Joe because he wasted Dampé's final days trying to make some money to cover his cancer bills, but it just didn't work out because Joe lost his matches. He lost to a dude named Lou who Yuri trained, and then he proceeded to repeatedly lose every match after that until eventually he kind of abandoned the group of kids he was taking care of. Sachio was there when Nambu died and Joe wasn't, and then Sachio told Joe to just get out of town at the funeral. Joe tries to atone for this over the next couple episodes by rebuilding the gym, and at points literally digging up his past and trying to repair his relationship with all the kids the best he can. But they don't want him around because it's been too long. He really isn't part of their lives at this point. And on top of this, he's kind of just acting on his own accord without talking to anyone. So no one really feels a connection to him. Anyway, so finally the last couple episodes of Nomad focus on this other boxer named Mac Rosario. And also this guy named Edison Liu. Liu has Jose Mendoza's nickname, the King of Kings, but Rosario has Mendoza's face and some other pieces of his life that were important for his backstory. Now, Liu gets destroyed by Mac in the exact same way that Carlos was destroyed by Jose, setting up the crossover grudge match trope that made Yabuki fight Mendoza, and in this case makes Gearless Joe fight Mac. We're also, at the last moment, introduced to this other minor new villain, Ryuko Sakuma. Mac has a backstory that he was a cop and he was paralyzed, and then through a combination of the skin graft gear that Yukiko developed and this brain control chip that Ryugo developed, he is able to lead a normal life and become a boxer again. But there's a twist, being that every so often the brain chip glitches out and makes Mac go into this feral all-instinct mode called Mac Time. Now, this is actually super beneficial and amazing when it happens in megaloboxing, but if it happens anywhere else, it's an unacceptable horror movie because it basically turns him to kind of a zombie, kind of like an animal. So yeah, just that's not good for this man's life. Now, considering Ryugo is honestly one of the only 100% original characters to exist in this anime world, I had a hard time rectifying him. Now, I think he's actually kind of a cool guy, but he takes a lot of the blame for Yukiko's unethical experiments, and to try and separate her from the ethical consequences of them, he's this kind of creepy tech nerd billionaire. He reminds me of a rich asshole I went to school with, crossed with Mark Beeks from DuckTales, and he's supposed to represent the kind of role that Mark Zuckerberg has played in modern society as an out-of-touch, elitist social media puppet master. Originally, he and Yukiko are developing this BES system to try and help people, But eventually a whistleblower leaks it to Yukiko that the Mac time phenomena that Ryugo was trying to cover up is like dangerous and like making Mac go crazy, and suddenly Yukiko and Ryugo end up hating each other. Ryugo points out that Yukiko is as guilty as he is because both of them developed this project, and logistically he's right, but Yukiko doesn't think that she's going to be held to the same consequences as Ryugo, and so she blackmails him to get the full rights to the tech and seemingly make even more money by this choice. Anyway, Yuri comes back as Lou's coach, but since Rikishi was dead at this point in the anime, he's barely a character at this point anymore. I can't tell if I should feel proud of him for all he's accomplished as a handicapped man, or sad knowing that really no one respects him anymore, because Yukiko seems to have instantly dumped him in an unexplained capacity. But I mean, knowing her character, it seems completely realistic that she would be too selfish to ever care for a handicapped man, even if it is her direct fault he is handicapped. Now, Yuri does come back to act as Joe's coach in the final battle though, and that was kind of cool. Anyway, after a couple of episodes where they filled in Mac's backstory, we eventually get to an exhibition match between Joe and Mac. Now, this is a big deal because it's the last fight of the entire series, and it's probably the only time in Nomad that Joe is back to 100% power. He's also fighting using Chief's gear as a tribute to him getting him off of drugs, and Mac is trying his hardest not to go into Mac time mode because he wants to have a real man-to-man fight with Joe without going into Berserker mode. Now, they fight for a while, but eventually Joe starts losing, hallucinating, seeing Chief and the roadkill dog again, and finally Sachio throws the match for Joe's side. As much as this final match matters, they really don't focus on it that much. Anyway, in the end, Yukiko completes her arc by releasing the technology her and Ryugo developed for worldwide medical development, while also paying some kind of $1 million fine for the unethical side of things, and letting Ryugo take the fall for his part in it, getting arrested for human experimentation and lying, I guess. I also think she stepped down from running her company, possibly temporarily, possibly for good. It's unclear. Yukiko is a poorly developed character. Anyway, so Nomad ends with Sachiko leaving the orphanage with Joe at the end, and Joe comes to peaceful terms with Nabu's ghost, who's still with him. Gearless Joe gets his second and presumably final happy ending, and that's good for him. I'm glad that Nomad really diverted hard from Ashita to give this Joe not one but two happy endings. None of the trauma and like all the glory. But there's actually a really interesting secret second ending that went over a lot of people's heads that I want to touch on real fast. So in the last minutes of Nomad, we see that Sachio is leaving town on Joe's bike. Now, I didn't notice it in Megalobox 1, but Sachio was always wearing this weird tacky orange hat. What's the big deal about that hat? Well, it's Joe Yabuki's hat. So in Nomad, when Sachio comes back as a teenager, he's bearing a certain resemblance to someone. And it's unclear at first, but as you go up throughout the season, that resemblance gets stronger and stronger until it becomes very clear in the last episode. Sachio grew up to be Joe Yabuki. I said in my review of Megalobox 1 that it ended with them trying to bring back boxing. And in Nomad, boxing didn't seem to matter anymore, so they full on embraced the Megaloboxing concept. Gearless Joe started using gear again, but what's crazy here is that whereas Megalobox 1 failed to bring back Ashita no Joe, in Nomad's ending, Sachio is Ashita no Joe. Sachio is Yabuki Joe now. So there's a few different ways you can interpret that. You can literally interpret it as a crazy fucking time loop. You can interpret it as just like an artistic time loop, and maybe it's time for you to watch Ashita no Joe Season 1. But you should also consider that if it is an artistic time loop, Nomad is the series that did bring back Ashita no Joe, finally. Or hell, maybe this is straight up an amazing cliffhanger, and if we are getting a Megalobox 3 someday, maybe it's going to follow Sachio as the brand new Joe Yabuki. Since the season was mostly off the rails as it is, this would be really cool because the legend of Joe would be back to life, and now he would be ready to have new adventures. So that's actually pretty crazy that after 2 seasons of Megalobox, we get Joe Yabuki back. I wasn't expecting that at all. So that's pretty cool. I was gonna skip giving these animes a score, but someone called me out the other day, so real fast. Original Ashita is still 7 out of 10. Ashita 2 is still 4 out of 10. Megalobox gets a 7 out of 10 too, because as good as it was, as many good things that Megalobox did, it's primarily a remake of Ashita no Joe, and therefore it can't really escape from the original framework of Ashita no Joe, even though it does do a lot with it by resetting in the future, making it more about boxing somehow than the original Ashita no Joe actually was, and doing a bunch of really cool things. Nomad, on the other hand, is going to get my highest marks of a 9 out of 10 because it deals with so many modern, crazy problems that I never expected to see tackled in an anime. Like the opioid epidemic, just the mass death that we've had lately, the whole immigration problem, and on top of that, the soundtrack to Megalobox 2 was completely perfect. The only cons I can say about Megalobox 2 is that I still wasn't really satisfied with the fact that Ryugo got punished and Yukiko didn't, because in my mind Yukiko was just as culpable for various reasons. And also, seriously, Mexico is not south of Tokyo. I know you guys want to drive from Tokyo to Mexico, but there's like an ocean, and even if theoretically the Pacific Ocean was gone in the future, that would still be like a really, really long drive. As me, Buster Green, thank you guys for watching this one. If you like my videos, please subscribe. I only need 297 subscribers to get monetized. Thank you very much. Okay, I need to do another cut-in at the end of this video again. Sorry. So this one's even weirder. Just brainstorming, like, what the fuck? So they took Sachi from Ashita no Joe, gender swapped her, and then grew her into Joe? Like, if you think about that too much, like, it gets bizarre. Just way too bizarre. Like, I'm not even sure how to wrap my head around that. Does that mean, like, Sachi is somehow Joe's grandmother? Does that mean, like, I feel like that's some, like, weird perversion of, like, Sachi's original dream to marry Joe Yabuki. So confusing. Just don't think about it as hard as I did, guys. Like, she's a little girl. Like, leave her alone. Alright, guys. I'm out. Bye.